My talk's going to be about emulating adversaries in the business. Auditors, that may have caught your attention a little bit. I don't think it's that of an exciting topic, but I'm going to try and motivate at least the purpose of auditing and how you can use it to the basic audit principles and how you could use it to incorporate with your purple team testing, and also how you can start emulating adversaries. So after a lunchtime talk, I know maybe the title Auditors is not that enticing, but essentially everything in offensive security, we can think of it as quality assurance almost. And I'm going to try and convince you in the next 40 minutes or so that everything we typically do in offensive security, whether it be trying to emulate adversaries, is really about auditing. So a little bit about who am I? I'm a senior penetration tester who started falling in love with threat emulation and purple teaming in general, and I'll get to that just in a little bit. But I first want to thank the organizers of Circle City. Without community resources and anything like that, this talk wouldn't even be possible. I wouldn't be able to give this type of presentation, especially with the resources that went into making purple teaming in general. There's a lot of great open source tooling that we'll get into and how you can actually use that to your benefit if you're looking to emulate adversaries. I originally started as an IT auditor, so that's essentially where that motivation also comes in, where I learned initially how to carry out audit exercises, everything in IT, network security, et cetera. I'm also part of a newly deployed team. We're called DenSecure. Wolf & Company. We're around, so if you want to chat, you can find us later, and we're also hiring, so definitely come talk if you're interested. My background's also in mathematics, for what it's worth. I remember when I was sitting in undergrad college classes, we always used to motivate problems, so I'll get into at least highlighting and demonstrating what I'm actually going to talk about just in a little bit. So the agenda. The first step that I want to talk about is the MITRE attack problem. That's a little bit over the top, and I'll get to explaining what that really means. But like I said, I just want to start motivating exactly how we got to the MITRE attack problem, I'll call it, and at least how to make it actionable so we can actually use in our internal networks as we're measuring defenses using those basic audit principles. I'll also just do a brief primer about what auditing really is about and why I'm trying to link the two between offensive security and auditing, and also give a primer between cybersecurity frameworks and how you could leverage that discussion or understanding of frameworks and incorporate it into the business as well. And then finally, I'll go into the actual tooling that exists out there. That way we can actually incorporate these types of tests cheaply and effectively. I'll start going through the most basic and simple exercise that you can perform, which is known as atomic testing. I like to refer to that as unit testing, again, the quality assurance type of mind of measuring your defenses. Microemulation, that's actually new. So on Thursday, MITRE Ingenuity, they actually just published a new type of plan that you can make, which is referred to as microemulation. It's really exciting because that lowers the barrier of entry for a lot of organizations. And I'll get to a little bit about that as well. And then I'll have some demos quickly just to kind of showcase how this all works in the background, especially if this is a new topic for any of you. Or even if you're in offensive security, if you do pen tests or any types of red team type of engagements, I think really in the future, as penetration testing or offensive security engagements start to evolve, I think this is going to be the next big thing. So I have my obligatory pyramid slide. If this is new to you, on the left-hand side, we have David Bianco's pyramid that was produced in 2013. It's an obligatory pyramid slide because every time we talk about MITRE attack, we like to bring up the pyramid of pain. The top is really the most important part, at least for the left-hand side. The way you can think about the pyramid and where MITRE attack really came from is when we're thinking about defenders, we're thinking about that kill chain, the cyber kill chain of what actors are doing for their objectives. They're doing reconnaissance, they're enumerating things in the network, they're escalating privileges, and then demonstrating some sort of impact. That's all true, but at least from a defensive perspective, this pyramid of pain really explained why defense is really difficult. So as an offensive security-minded individual, our goal is to always try to help the blue team. And sometimes we get carried away, at least from the red team side, where we get really excited about doing really flashy things, we get domain admin, but trivially, there's some really simple things, as we commonly heard in the news in the past couple of days, that still work. And the behavior part of an actor is the most difficult part to detect, but is going to return the highest in terms of security impact for your organization. The bottom is hash values. You can kind of figure out what the other pieces if it's the first time you're seeing it. But for example, if I went to VirusTotal and just downloaded a malware sample or something like that, that's very easy for defenders to detect on, but it's also very easy from an attacker perspective to change and modify. But for behaviors, I like drinking coffee. So whenever I go to Starbucks or Dunkin', I'm going to get a shot of espresso. And all of a sudden, if you remove that, so if you're targeting my behaviors of removing my caffeine intake, I'm going to have to start figuring out different ways of accomplishing an objective. And you can start thinking about that a little bit for adversary actions as well. The pyramid on the right is somewhat new. It's from Scythe. Scythe is a purple team framework. I'm going to refer to a lot of different community resources, Scythe being one of them. They make a command and control platform to carry out purple team exercises. The reason I have this new slide that was developed by Chris Peacock is because at the very top is procedure data. So similarly, at the top is the most important part of the pyramid of pain. Procedure data from the MITRE ATT&CK framework is the most important thing to carry out, because MITRE ATT&CK is really just a classification scheme. And that's the first time you're hearing it. I'll go into the actual framework and how it really is laid out, at least the enterprise one. But think about procedures meaning actions. So specifically on the command line, what actors are actually doing. And we'll get into that in just a moment. I don't know what is going on with all the pyramids, though. We kind of have this pyramid scheme problem. I'm not sure why a lot of the purple team guys, we keep on making new pyramids. Try not to motivate in the business if you're talking to executives, because you can run into a nice problem, obviously. So why auditing? Why am I talking about auditing and trying to link that between offense and security? That's because businesses most likely already understand what auditing is. That's already a measure that they're used to. If you're in an organization, you're probably getting audited, especially a public one. SOX auditing, cybersecurity audits. Audits are almost endless in organizations, and they're very used to at least understanding what an audit is. That's not true for offensive testing, though, because we still don't have a common language between how we do penetration tests. In some cases, how that's evolved for the past decade or so is traditionally we would run a vulnerability scan. We'd identify vulnerabilities, and we try to exploit them. And that's evolved slowly over time, where now people are focusing on premises Active Directory. There's new offensive capabilities to carry out those exercises. But we still have that running theme where not enough organizations are either doing that offensive security testing, or the quality or production of those tests there's no common language of what actually means. We've seen reports, for example, of a vulnerability scan, and that gets handed off as a pen test. There's a kind of this reoccurring theme. Versus auditing, businesses kind of know how that's structured and how that's supposed to work. So if we use that common language of at least incorporating our offensive security test in a style of an audit, there's real return on that. And not only that, regulators or other auditors are going to start doing these types of tests. I've already seen it happen where regulators are asking for these types of tests to happen. And if that's the case, we want to make sure our auditors are not just college-educated graduate students, which is oftentimes the case. They're going off their checklist of just a Word document and they're performing an audit. We want to make sure there's technical capabilities and knowledge. And that's not a skill gap. That's more of, we want to make sure that people are understanding how to actually leverage these frameworks and not just carrying out these exercises just because someone else told them to. But basic audit principles are really the 3 bullets here. So we want to measure the effectiveness of the control, meaning that if we have an EDR, if we have a SIM, so if we're really talking about the internal network or the totality of the entire internal network, we're considering what we actually want to measure. We create repeatable test cases, meaning that if I perform an action, so if I want to emulate an adversary, I want to do ransomware, I want to do a very basic discovery exercise of I found this very interesting threat actor that may be impacting my industry. I know they do this step of actions for discovery. I should be able to create repeatable processes so that anyone can incorporate that test in the future, especially if it failed or my assumptions were not validated. Finally, it's determining the overall confidence. We're never going to be 100% sure that we're going to be able to prevent phishing, right? So phishing are types of exercises that we do to train our end users. Obviously, there's strong opinions of how effective phishing obviously is, but we're never going to obviously end just stopping doing phishing training or anything like that, right? We always have some sort of confidence or degree of variability of how well we think a control actually is working and operating. So I mentioned I've seen regulators and other auditors start to try and incorporate these types of tests, and I think it's really important to start having a conversation of how to effectively use MITRE ATT&CK and perform these test cases. That way we don't run into that previous problem that I was mentioning with penetration testing. If I talk to someone else, what is a pen test to them, we're probably going to run into the 2 different completely type of tests, unfortunately. So I want to make sure, at least if you take anything away from this talk, making sure if you are an auditor or want to think like an auditor, we go through this methodology simply first. We start simple and easy, and we can slowly evolve it over time and make it better. So validating assumptions is the most important part because we are probably one of the only industries or in technology where we constantly throw hundreds of thousands of dollars in solutions, and the only time they really get tested is through a breach. Maybe they get tested from a penetration test, but that's never really the objective of a pen test. It's just maybe could happen. I commonly hear some folks on our team or other teams from a red teamer, they'll say, oh, I bypassed EDR. I was able to dump LSAS. I opened up Task Manager, and I dumped LSAS, and I got all the creds. And then we never really go back during the pen test to say, why did that happen on that system? Because we weren't able to dump LSAS on this system, but for whatever reason, this one worked. And we kind of just wave our hands and say, good luck to the blue team. We were able to own all the stuff. We got all the creds. We got domain admin. So that's the key differentiation between this offensive style of testing, where we want to have that collaboration more so and really focus on the control environment to validate that, hey, why did that not happen? We thought that we have this EDR tool, we have this really flashy and expensive tool, we have a set of assumptions, and we're going to test them before a malicious actor can. That screenshot, at least that I have there, is from a audit exercise. It's referred to as model validation. You don't really need to know the specifics about it, but I just thought it was interesting because this is from an excerpt from the FDIC. If people are in financial institutions or banking, you probably are scared of the FDIC or have heard of model validation at least. And that's really at least what I view an atomic test or these unit tests that we'll be carrying out against the controller environment. We're really measuring a system input, so we perform an action, and what is that outcome? Is it expected? Is there retuning of the control that we need to perform? And what is that variance that we have of the confidence for our general controls? So let's just do a brief primer of attack. I've motivated at least what the pyramids are of how attack was really came to grow. I don't have a screenshot of the enterprise framework because it can be really overwhelming. And I invite you to explore that framework yourself. So if you search up MITRE ATT&CK, start exploring it. And the main takeaway, at least for how I want you to view the framework, is really just a classification scheme. Attack is now probably one of the most common buzzwords in our industry. If you look at any defensive control or tool out there, they most likely already map to MITRE ATT&CK, and they have these technique IDs where I mentioned dumping credentials. That's already a T1003, and they'll put that as an alert for you to map back to MITRE ATT&CK. I'll get to another unfortunate reality of not only that it's in our industry, which is great for classification and having a common language, but vendors and marketing can take that and run with it where they can start saying some bold claims where they start saying things like, we're 100% mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. And that's one massive trap that I'll get into because you never want to view MITRE ATT&CK as a roadmap of the checklist, right? We're not producing a checklist for anyone to just run through. We're using it as a classification scheme to talk about actions that an adversary will take in the network. Last section here, I just want to focus on is also procedures. Where MITRE ATT&CK really comes from is that classification scheme of understanding actions. The Uber breach is somewhat still fresh in mind, but if we take that as an example of what has occurred, I only bring it up just because of how rich the data out there is. That's an example of where we can take an understanding of how that attack was actually carried out and how that breach was executed, and we can start making an emulation plan from that, right? So what happened? There was a phishing coordinated, so the actor was able to phish an end user. They collected credentials, and they fatigue bombed the end user with MFA requests. If you haven't heard about that breach, or maybe it's still in the news, that's essentially the sum up of what happened. And we can classify those actions back to MITRE ATT&CK. So it's common language that attackers can quickly know and understand what we're really referring to. Otherwise, we can get into the situation where defenders, if I say this is a CVE or this is an exploit, we don't really have a really great way of talking about actions that an adversary can do. And that's where MITRE ATT&CK came in to make that classification scheme for us. So let's talk about a little bit what the attack traps are. I mentioned it's not a checklist, right? We're not playing bingo with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We're not looking to say, I want to be 100% confident in every single technique and sub-technique. That framework is constantly growing. It's being expanded upon. And MITRE ATT&CK looks at observed attacker data. That's important to know because there are some actions that are maybe still novel or nuanced. So if people have heard of, for example, like as a red teamer or offensive security team, maybe you perform a class of phishing like device code phishing or perform some novel technique that just hasn't been known publicly just yet, that's not going to be in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you can probably classify it as such, but at least what's in the MITRE ATT&CK framework is observed data. Emulating actual adversaries is also pretty difficult, right? So even though that we have the framework, we still have to make test cases that we can easily take into the internal network in our organizations and carry out those types of exercises. And then finally, KRIs or KPIs, those kind of key indicators that we report to executives or at least the business to actually understand what we're doing, they could be misleading, right? So if we try to take attack and we want to make an emulation plan, meaning I see these types of techniques that I want to test my control environment to, we can't just bring out and say we're 100% confident, like I was saying. You can't just be, there's going to be some degree of variance, and you want to be at least realistic with your expectations and how you actually produce reports to executive teams or other leaderships that don't have the nuance or understanding of what we're actually doing. One of the biggest problems is that MITRE ATT&CK is now a buzzword, but I often see that at least smaller organizations or maybe really the top 5% even know how to actually use MITRE ATT&CK in a meaningful way or make it actionable. We oftentimes see that MITRE ATT&CK is just this buzzword, and security teams don't even know what you could really use it. How can you actually use it internally? There's a huge gap between the skill sets that the trickle-down effect in cybersecurity, where members and top leading teams, high-end resources, they can do these types of tests, but then the small businesses and mid-sized organizations, they're kind of left empty-handed. They don't have the capabilities to run these types of emulations. So that's one hope that I hope I can try to touch on just a little bit. One image down there, if you can't see it, that's a Twitter search. I didn't show the results because it still horrifies me a little bit, but if you search 100% MITRE ATT&CK coverage, that was the idea that I had in terms of trying to propose what happens with marketing and vendors. They're running with the attack framework and just proposing that their solution is the best. We map 100% MITRE ATT&CK. If you ever hear that or people trying to claim that, start running away and look for someone else. So I already mentioned the industry issues a little bit, but for example, the security tools, all of them now map back to MITRE ATT&CK, and if a smaller or mid-sized organizations don't even know how to use it, that's a huge gap in at least training or at least educating how to use that framework. And then the one on the bottom here, that multi-factor authentication request generation, that's the one that was abused in not only in Uber, but other organizations, at least when a breach occurred, meaning that red teamers and offensive security teams, we knew that if you start bombing end users with an MFA token, so if we capture credentials, if we phish that or guess the password, and then we see an MFA prompt that there's a soft token associated with that on their phone, like Okta, for example, or Microsoft Authenticator, where you just say, yes, that was me that logged in. We've known that's been an attack vector for quite some time. It's worked in pen tests and other red team types of exercises, but that wasn't in MITRE ATT&CK only until this past year. So it's important to understand that although we can leverage this framework to start enhancing our control environment, that doesn't mean it's going to be the end, and you can't just rely on MITRE ATT&CK to be your solution or silver bullet in cybersecurity. So where does MITRE ATT&CK even come from? The observed data is really important. So it's everything that's in cyber threat intelligence reporting, the public reporting that we have. The Uber breach, I don't want to blame Uber or anything, but they're a really good example of that's pretty rich data that we have from an attacker essentially posting or researchers posting what the attacker was doing on Twitter. So we could look at Twitter and making an emulation plan. We can map that back to MITRE ATT&CK. Another really good one is the Cisco breach that occurred a couple months ago, but they really took, I thought, really a great approach. The Talos security blog, once the actor essentially claimed that Cisco was breached, Cisco Talos, they labeled and went through the exact steps that the attacker took in the network, notifying not only the techniques and what was executed, they went even further of showing the exact command line that was ran. And we need more of that because public cyber threat intelligence is sometimes lacking, and MITRE ATT&CK is there. And since it's such a buzzword, oftentimes the reports that we do get is just, here's the techniques they ran. They did T1003 credential dumping, they did phishing. But as a person who's trying to emulate the adversary, so if we're trying to bring that in the internal network, I have no idea of how I'm actually going to make a plan or a test case. What commands do I need to run? Did they do spear phishing? Did they do phishing with a link in it? Is there a download that they did? Or what sort of commands did they actually run? So in terms of the grand scheme of the layout of how we can actually use MITRE ATT&CK, It's the procedure data and actions that we need to use to actually emulate adversaries. And that all comes from public reporting. There's obviously private cyber threat intelligence, so you could probably leverage that if you do have subscription fees to that or aware of it. But the public space is where at least small businesses and mid-sized organizations are going to be able to take direct action to build those test cases. So this is a brief example of how it's made. Again, this is public, so if you wanted to go on the MITRE ATT&CK website, this is an example of cyber threat intelligence reporting. So those reports that come out from breaches, the DBER report is really great, a great resource in terms of them analyzing breach data and trying to map that back to attack. Everything that's publicly available to us, we can start classifying those actions and map back to MITRE ATT&CK. Once we have a common theme of understanding of what techniques an actor is performing, we can either compound those techniques together to make an emulation plan. So in this case, if I wanted to make an emulation plan from this, I'm bringing an audit exercise. I could do spear phishing link. I could do spear phishing attachment, so having an attachment associated with that email, and there's going to be some sort of execution. That could be confusing because, again, when I'm mentioning the techniques here, there's not enough procedure data maybe for me to make actions on it, and I may have to make guesses to make sure that I'm actually emulating that set adversary. And that could be okay, but that's where, again, that procedure data is really important for us to be able to actually emulate an adversary and see what the actual results would be against a threat. So there's a ton of techniques and sub-techniques in MITRE ATT&CK, the enterprise framework. A good question from an auditing principle would be, what is important to prioritize? Because I mentioned a lot of credential dumping. That's a very common attack technique and probably the highest alert that you'd get from your EDR SIM, so that's T1003. That could be a good place to start. MITRE Ingenuity, the Center for Threat Informed Defense, they have released this calculator, we can call it, that essentially starts mapping out different procedures or techniques that are going to be the ones that are either have the most procedures or ways to emulate said action, the ones that have interdependencies. So if we think about executing PowerShell or malicious PowerShell or doing process injection, for example, there's going to be several techniques tied to an active performing process injection. So they try to have this calculator where not only do they map the technique and give you like a scoring to prioritize with your emulation plan, they also map back to specific frameworks. So tying this back to the business, if my business is doing the CIS controls, and I have an assumption that there's a gap between CIS control, let's call number 4 or 5, whatever, like let's say there's a assumption that there's a gap there. I can bring that to the business and make an emulation plan that's going to hit and showcase that gap potentially inside, and try to bring in more resources internally to try and solve that hidden gap essentially. So Conti is another really good example of an emulation plan that we can quickly make. The one additional trap that I'm going to mention here is if we wanted to emulate Conti, we can do that, but this is Conti from 2021, right? So if we wanted to make an emulation plan focusing on Conti, so we have that translated playbook. They're the ransomware as a service affiliate group that was publishing this documentation internally. They were using Cobalt Strike to execute ransomware in internal networks. So someone would achieve initial access. They would come in with Cobalt Strike, a beacon is kind of running, and they would do these specific actions. This is their playbook internally that they're using. Internally, they had this playbook. So the ransomware as a service group had several different actors performing these actions. And this playbook's really powerful because we get the sense of what actors are actually doing. Some of it's very trivial examples of shell who am I? So running a basic command like that, or enumerating domain controllers, very basic commands to discover hosts. And while that may sound trivial in itself, that's very powerful for us to understand what actors are actually doing. What behaviors are they going to be doing in a network? But that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to prepare you for Conti of next year, right? So they're now going to enhance their capabilities as well. But at least in an emulation plan, if you have that understanding, we can have a different objective for how we're going to test our control environment. And make sure you want to use existing resources. So there's no reason why we should shy away from leveraging public and open source resources. That way we can make the best emulation plan possible. So Scythe has a really great Purple Team exercise framework. That's on version 2 now. And public document where you can start getting an understanding of how you can become an operator, quote unquote, how you can actually carry out these test cases. And not only that, but how you should be reporting on it. Reporting is very difficult still. It's still somewhat new. People are trying different things of how you can maybe show different heat maps, of here's the actual actions that we performed. It's still somewhat in the process of being developed, I think personally, and it's not really solved just yet. But there's different ways we can start approaching it to approach teams internally. So if you have an audit team internally, this is a good way to say, hey, we've never done a system input or model validation against our SIM or EDR. Why don't we start doing that? And I guarantee you that in a year or so, the audit team is probably trying to figure out what they want to audit anyways. And if you're bringing in an idea to them that they have never audited before, it's a high-risk system, an EDR or SIM, we could probably classify it as such, they probably want to incorporate that with their audit test case plan. And we can kind of work in conjunction with not only as offensive security or security teams that are still building out their capabilities, they can work with existing resources internally. So audit teams, if you have a third-party auditor, you can start motivating, let's start doing something that's going to be actually high return rather than a college graduate student that just is getting a checklist and going through a list, unfortunately for auditors. If you've been audited and have ran into a scenario, I feel your pain, but over time, that's kind of the goal behind this. We want to make sure people have the resources and education to know how to carry out these exercises, and we're not just hiding that away from like the top 5% of the industry. So I mentioned the red teams like to be really sophisticated. We want to show off, but sometimes you just have to start simple and motivate at least an understanding of let's do very simple actions before we get really complicated and do like a full team purple team exercise. Let's just start simple of doing specific actions, make a more specific test case and emulation plan, and then slowly we'll get into more advanced techniques, but dependent on what are we actually seeing in the wild and what's actually important to us internally. I just thought this was a funny image because that's Steve Borosh, his Twitter there, and that tweet is just, it speaks to a lot of what's going on in the industry because our offensive teams are usually very sophisticated and can execute very complicated attack chains. We have a lot of capabilities and we can execute these techniques. However, a nation state, quote unquote, that it was executing ransomware, put Mimikatz on a domain controller. And that was as simple as them ransomwaring an organization. So if we put Mimikatz, now we become a nation state or an adversary. So that's just something to think about where there's a ceiling of levels of our red teams are sometimes even better than the 18-year-old that is hacking organizations. And if that's the case, maybe we need to take a glance at what's actually important to us and how we're assessing controls and take our time with actually making these emulation plans to get the most return in our defenses. So how do we actually do this? So I kind of talked a lot about theory and how we can use audit principles and incorporate that in our test cases. To start simply, the very first place you should start. So if you've never done a purple team or you've heard of that, this is the first time you're hearing anything about purple teaming or anything like that. The first place you should start is something called atomic testing or unit testing. That's basic QA for your EDR, your SIM, or something you're trying to measure. What I mean by that is you're going to make that emulation plan. So you're going to identify the techniques or threat actors that's relevant. You can even just take the top 10. So Red Canary has their annual report that they produce of the top 10 techniques that malicious actors do. We don't maybe need to even specify a group. We can just say, these are the techniques that we care about the most of assessing. We're going to assume that our controls are going to do very well against them and really test them and see and just demonstrate to the business that, hey, we did this test. We know that this control is actually working. So that way our resources are going into the right investments and we're making the right decisions. So atomic testing is very simple, but the accuracy and realism is lost in that sense. So you have to realize that too. So although we could do these unit tests of running single actions, so an atomic test could be as simple as just running who am I in PowerShell. Or it could be putting Mimikatz on a domain controller and seeing what the outcomes are. That's not really fully fleshing out an attack chain or theorizing what actions an attacker could do. So that's where the emulation part gets very difficult. So although atomic testing is really great to get the telemetry and understanding of what's actually occurring in the background with their systems, over time you're going to want to advance a little bit further. So if you don't have the capabilities to run an atomic test yourself, there's already open source resources. I mentioned Red Canary. They also maintain the Atomic Red Team, which is a library of automated ways to run these types of test cases. And that's an immediate place you could start, where if you've never even assessed your EDR or didn't know that you should be, definitely start there of just seeing what the outcomes are. I guarantee the EDR is probably only going to pick up on the highest level of alerts. And while it would log the lower level tier, that's where you need to start tuning in and assessing it throughout your environment. What I have in the image, by the way, is a screenshot to the Splunk attack range. They're now on version 2. So that's an easy way to at least get started. So you want to make sure you're doing this in a controlled manner because these are offensive actions, right? We're performing emulations and actions as an adversary. So a good place to get started is something like a lab environment. And that's a Splunk attack range where you can quickly set up infrastructure all in the cloud, separated from your production environment, see what you're actually going to be running, and how things should appear on defensive controls. They have Splunk already started there. If you don't have Splunk, you can at least get a sense of the data that should exist on your end controls. Another tool that I'm going to mention quickly too is Prelude Operator. The Prelude team is one important resource that is extending where I think Atomic Red Team isn't a great place to perform the atomic testing or those basic unit tests, but Prelude Operator is one evolution that you can think of it as to start maturizing that process. So atomic testing really good to get end results of, did I get the expected result of an output that I'm looking for? Prelude Operator starts building out attacker methodology and chains where it has a remote access beacon, you can think of it as. So we have a tangible process that's running and carrying out these different actions. So not only are you running who am I, you could start building out different techniques on top of each other. You're going to run who am I, you're going to enumerate domain controllers, you're going to find users who logged in and discover all network shares. Almost taking the playbook of Conti and doing that all in an action of under a separate process that's running. So it gives the EDR a little bit more of a fair fight to start investigating and triaging those different events into one generic incident or alert. This image is from the microemulation blog that MiterEngineer produced. Again, that was just published 2 days ago. So this is still somewhat new in the industry of trying to figure out a common ground of how teams can actually carry out these exercises. I really love this image because it showcases the evolutions that you can make in terms of how you can actually produce emulation plans. So if you don't have the teams or resources to carry out a purple team, well, you could start basic and simple of just running an atomic test, right? So you can go to management, you can go to executives and say, we haven't tested our EDR. How can we incorporate things that already exist? So if it's an audit team that's in the background, maybe that's something they should be reviewing or at least assisting you with. Or two, if you're a defender on the blue team and you just don't have the resources or capabilities, that's some place you can just start simple and demonstrate value in return of, let's use a common language that we have. Maybe you're in the weeds of understanding how the EDR works, how these defensive controls all work in your environment, and you're wearing multiple hats of IT and security combined. But then you can start using their language, right? We could use the frameworks that businesses actually understand, like the CIS controls, the top 18, NIST CSF. And if we start mapping that back to each other, we can have that common language and start getting more investments to actual resources that we actually need. Microemulations are a little bit more interesting. That's kind of using that chain methodology where we're trying to execute various actions automatically for us. So rather than isolating a specific unit test of just running who am I, it starts emulating a plan a little bit more defined of an actual objective that an attacker may want to perform. So discovery or lateral movement, that could be its own microemulation that we can think of just putting on a lot of procedures and just testing out the entire environment. And then finally, a real full-fledged style purple team, where unfortunately it's still at the kind of 5 to 10% of the cybersecurity space that actually performs purple teams, at least the way you would think of. The same is somewhat true with red teams. But as we start building out and have that trickle-down effect, and more organizations starting to do these types of tests, I think we're going to be at least better off than having a malicious actor do those types of tests for us. I just wanted to, I have these videos and these slides will also be readily available. So if this video doesn't come out that greatest, I just wanted to showcase some videos of what it actually looks like. A lot of the time this is still somewhat new to people and they haven't seen tangible guides of what it actually looks like when you do a test case. I promise it's as simple as I'm trying to make it sound, where you just run a PowerShell script and you're just emulating an adversary. And that's the whole idea behind it. We want to make this easily, cheap, and effective for organizations to bring into their environments tomorrow. So one example that I'll run, and I'll try to talk over it as we approach time, is on the top here, I'm looking at the Red Canary GitHub. That's their Atomic Red Team Suite library. And I'm just highlighting the technique that maybe I'm interested in executing or carrying out as an atomic test case. In this one, the technique is referred to as credential dumping, but specifically I'm looking at NTDS dumping. Here's all the relevant atomic test cases. they show you the command of how to run a action. So if I don't even know how to do an NTDS dump, here's the exact action that I can perform. I'm going to pause really quickly just to explain what's going on. I've set up an attack range using Splunk attack range v2. That's simply just running a Terraform script. It deploys to AWS if you just provide it the necessary access, and it builds this lab environment with all these nice tools. It comes with the Atomic Red team, and I can quickly start test casing out different actions that I want to see what the results are. So at the top left-hand corner, if you see where the shell actually starts, I'm running attack range here, and I'm simulating using Atomic Red team. And the specific sub-technique that I'm running is T1003. So that's the NTDS dump. That's from the Red Canary Atomic Library. And then finally, I am specifying my target, which in this case, it's already created for me. And on the bottom, it starts running that test case for me. So it's going to play. It's going to gather all the evidence of making sure that the test case was actually validated and successful. Again, making those repeatable test cases. So that way, when I run a test case, I can go back and anyone could observe what actually happened, and it validated that it ran successfully, and then see tangible evidence that it ran. We collect the credentials either successfully. We can assess what the output is from our control environment. I'll just skip ahead a little bit. So after that test case is done, this may be a little bit blurry. Let's see if it comes up. Let's go back. I just want to show you what Splunk has in their attack range. I'm going to pause here. You can see what actually happened in terms of the atomic testing that we performed. So the Splunk range is already nice where it has this kind of SOAR dashboard that you can start visualizing the simulations you're running. Obviously, your tools may be a little bit different, but just to motivate how easy it is to start performing these actions and how you can start assessing what the results are, here's the atomic test that we ran. We can see the exact command line data that we ran, if it actually ran successfully, or maybe we didn't even get the telemetry. We didn't see what our defensive controls for some reason didn't capture this evidence. And that's an example of a test case just running very simply. And over time, you can start maturizing that or enhancing that to be a little bit more complicated. That's one test case with atomic testing, unit testing, but then we can get more complicated where we start using maybe a C2. Maybe we want to run a beacon with Cobalt Strike or with a Purple Team framework, like something with SICE or something, just to get a little bit more complicated and see what the actual results are. So I know we're coming up on time, and I have a couple more videos here, which you're happy to look at through my slides. I go into how to use Preload Operator. I also have slides about using Vector, which is a free solution, like the community ran by the security risk advisors, but they try to solve the problem with actually producing reports in a meaningful way for executives and other people to understand. Because I'm going really in the weeds of how to perform these test cases. The most important part is able to explain what we're actually doing. How do we actually explain what does an NTDS dump really mean? Is an executive going to necessarily need to know the details of how I ran that action? Not necessarily, but if they understand that, hey, we're good against this credential access or someone trying to obtain credentials, we've been able to test that in several different examples, and here's our confidence of how well we think we can do against an actor that may be doing that. I know we're essentially right on time, so I want to pause and just make sure if there's any questions or comments. Good. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer is yes. I didn't really go too much into threat modeling, but if you want to make a business case to executives or memberships of they're hearing on the news, for example, they just heard on the news Uber. So in their next strategic meetings, they're going to be talking about Uber and that breach. And then if you already came prepared to that meeting as a security professional or someone who wants to be able to showcase how we can defend against it, you can come prepared and saying, well, this is the threat profile. It's seemingly a teenager. I'm not sure the specifics who carried the attack. I don't know if it's published, but it's seemingly a teenager. Is this relevant to our industry? Most likely, yes. Or maybe ransomware is another threat profile that we want to care about. You could start listing out, here's public cyber threat intelligence, and I want to create a test case. I want to see how our controls actually do. We've never done a test case, and that'll give you more return on investment, in my opinion, of coming prepared with talking about something that's either industry known. So boards and executives are unfortunately going to start talking about Uber. But if you come prepared with an answer of saying, well, I know the actions, here's how we can classify them. They don't need to know the T10 metrics, but we can start talking about that in a common language and say, well, if you want to test it, we can run these kind of audits internally and see what the outcomes are. Good. Yeah, so that was that's on MITRE Ingenuity. If you look up MITRE attack calculator for MITRE Ingenuity, that should come up. That's the MITRE Ingenuity does a lot of different things. They also do the attack evals, which I didn't really get into, but I highly recommend looking up the attack evals. That's going to give you a good perspective of how to run these emulation plans because they're the ones actually carrying out these exercises. One thing that I'm just going to shoot out just because I think it's really important to know, they somehow managed to get every EDR vendor and the next evaluation is MDR, but somehow they were able to convince a lot of EDR vendors or the big name players to come into an emulation plan exercise and they just test EDRs. They're kind of doing these emulation plans that I was mentioning against EDRs. It's all publicly available. You can see what the outcomes are for each EDR and see how everything compares. If you haven't looked at attack evals, I highly recommend it. It's not just a buzzword. Definitely, it's really rich and great data that they have out there. Good. Yeah. Yep. So I'm only talking about the free community resources just because, in my opinion, it's still lackluster in the mid-sized organizations. Like they don't have the resources to go out and purchase a $5,000, $10,000 tool tomorrow. So that's why I'm really talking about the free tools because they're effective and they actually work. But those are really great examples. I mentioned Scythe. Attack IQ has attack platforms like the breach attack simulation tools. They can do it kind of for you in a way that if you have the resources and you want to test it out, by all means, go for it. But these are really quick returns that you can quickly bring into your environment and test immediately. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so that's a problem not only in this space, but that's just cybersecurity reporting in general, right? We're just flooding executives with, we stopped 100,000, and we have so much signals on data, and this is what we did with our firewall. That's honestly a ton of junk, honestly, data. And the same is kind of almost true with how we're reporting on MITRE ATT&CK, unfortunately, to answer your question. Executives like really quick one-image blurbs. They're not going to be the technical experts of understanding what NTDS dumping is or anything like that. But if you have that confidence matrix, like I'm a big fan of the heat maps. So if you're maybe not even using MITRE ATT&CK per se, but if you can develop like a heat map or attack flow data, like kind of telling a story is the best way I can think of it, as what an attacker would do from not necessarily the specific actions, but what they're trying to do in the environment and how this is either green, good, how we did in the exercise, this is bad, or like more red, kind of signaling to them of the entire exercise. It's a really hard problem. I don't have like a specific solution, but trying to make a story, I think, is the best way to kind of go about it. Okay. I think we're on time. So like I mentioned, the slides will be available. I'll be around too if anyone wants to chat. But thank you, everyone, for attending. Yeah.